We're very excited to kickstart the session today. On the screen, you'll see a brief agenda of the session. So the session's purpose is to together learn about the different aspects of operationalizing diversity and inclusion, sharing challenges and identifying good practices, and also to pave the way for further actions that contribute towards shifting the power and anti-racism within the sector. So I'll just quickly introduce our panel and guest speakers today. Before I do that, I just want to note that this session is a continuation of a previous session held at Accountable Now's AGM in May of this year. So due to a lack of time, we didn't have the opportunity to hear some of the presentations fully and have a discussion amongst ourselves in the different ways that our organizations are working towards diversity and inclusion. And so we're holding this second session to enable more interaction. If you did not join the first session, don't worry at all. This is designed to be a standalone session as well. So in terms of our panel and guest speakers, panels and also panel members, please turn your camera on and wave a little bit when I mention your name. So we have Jean Scrimger at Accountability Lab. In the previous session, she shared about how the lab engages and listens to communities, meeting them where they are at to shift power. Oriana Castillo from CIVICUS, who's spoken about CIVICUS's approach to supporting its member and partner organizations to carrying out diversity and inclusion audits, and also highlighting areas for potential improvement. And also Andreas De La Torres and Jay Golden from CARE International. We will actually hear the presentation from them very shortly about how CARE International approaches measuring diversity and inclusion internally. And lastly, our session is facilitated by Tina from the Better Org. I'll pass the mic on to Tina, who will start our session off by unpacking diversity and inclusion. Tina, please take it away.
Thanks very much, Bauhan, and it's a pleasure to meet everybody. So my name is Tina Ajonima, and I'm from the Better Org, which is an organizational development consultancy that supports organizations in the nonprofit and social impact space with working on their cultures and internal ways of working. And as part of that, we do a lot of work with organizations around diversity, equity and inclusion and anti-oppression and anti-racism. And so it's a pleasure to be here with everyone today, just participating in this very important conversation. So I thought I'd just say a little bit about diversity and inclusion and what it means or what it could mean for organizations. So at the Better Org, we partner with lots of different organizations who are all at different stages of their D&I journey, so their diversity and equity and inclusion journey. And as part of this, we often have really interesting conversations with leaders in this organization about what this work means. So what does it mean to engage in D&I? And we find that this is often a stumbling block for lots of organizations. And it's really not surprising on one hand, because there are lots of different, if you think about diversity, equity and inclusion and how it's referred to, there's lots of different terms out there which are in use. So if we just go to the next slide and maybe just click through. Thank you. So yeah, you see it on the screen. There's lots of different terms that are used to refer to this area of work, really. So we've got diversity, which is looking at more authentic representation, inclusion, making others feel seen, equality, which is access given to everyone, irrespective of the context that they exist in. We've got equity, which is access that takes into account context. We've got belonging, which is the idea that you feel that you are seen. We've got justice, which is about dismantling barriers to resource and opportunities. We've got accountability, which is about, having clear ownership and responsibility of ownership. And then we've got the various combinations. So we've got D&I, we've got DEI, we've got JEDI, we've got REDI, we've got GEDI, we've got IDEA. So there's so much out there, so many words, so many acronyms, so many combinations. And we spend a lot of time getting caught up in this. This is what we find with organizations, spend a lot of time getting caught up in which combination of words works, what combination of words should we use. And I really, when I kind of have these conversations with these organizations, and I kind of want to put this on the table to you all today, is I really want to encourage us to think beyond this. So to think beyond the use of these words or these combinations of these words, and instead focus on the real kind of truth, which should sit at the core of this work. So if we just go to the next slide, I believe that whatever words we use, whatever acronyms we use, that the work of diversity and inclusion is fundamentally about challenging us and catalyzing us to consider the following, to consider some of these things. So how do we respect and honor our experiences and our perspectives, which are simultaneously unique and also shared, which is the beauty of us being human? How do we create spaces that uphold the dignity of all who enter the space and maintain the dignity of people who leave the space? How do we truthfully celebrate value and worth that we all hold, whether it's the value and worth that we hold as individuals, as communities, or collectively? And then finally, what are we doing? So what action are we taking to ensure that everyone, irrespective of circumstance, is able to fully thrive and flourish? So for me, this is the purpose of D&I work. This is the why of the work. This is the core of the work. And this is something that I, as I say, I encourage organizations to think about, and encourage you all today to think about the purpose of the work, to think about the why of the work. Why is this work so important to you and your organization? So as Balhan said, today we're going to hear from some really interesting organizations about the why of their work, the purpose of their work. And hopefully we're going to also hear from you in the breakout rooms about the whys for your organizations, and also the things that you're doing within your organizations to help give form to your why, both through the actions and activities that you're going to take, but also the way in which you measure your progress and measure the impact of those activities. So without further ado, I'm delighted to invite Jay and Andres from Care International to share their D&I story with us.
Thank you, Tina, and thank you, Accountable Now, for the invitation. For those of you who were in the previous session, apologies if we repeat a bit. We had to rush last time to accommodate the different presentations, but I hope it's still useful to hear us today. My name is Andres. I work for the Care International Secretariat, and I am based in London. I'm from Peru. And Jay will introduce himself when he speaks. I will try to speak for a couple of minutes only to leave most of the time to him. Care International is a confederation of 21 independent organizations, and that's very important to understand, or to say to you, to try to position this discussion for us. No? So what in the end diversity and inclusion means for us. A confederation of 21 different organizations from their own countries, independent, autonomous, that share some things, like a name, for example, or not, because some of our members or affiliates use their own different names. For example, our affiliate in Sri Lanka, it's called Chrysalis, or our member in Thailand is called Rakstai. Sometimes they will refer to Care Thailand, but many times not. So within that framework of 21 independent organizations, we are in this journey, sometimes a difficult word, but it process evolving times, trying to really land what diversity and inclusion means for us. So a couple of key points in the next slide. I think please if we can move to the next one. So first of all, and I won't repeat theory, but I hope most of us agree that all these concepts are important and they're different. And DEI is not anti-racism, and DEI is not necessarily the same thing for everyone. We understand certain concepts in different ways. We are trying to document and share and discuss, and we are doing it internally at Care, what all these concepts mean for the different 21 members, but also within the members, for the different structures within the members, some of them with country offices, some of them with not, working with partners and local organizations, some of them huge, some of them small. Each of them have an understanding, and that's the important thing. Now, we can challenge each other and we can support each other in develop and further evolving that understanding that sometimes may have been very conservative, sometimes a bit more progressive, but that's part of the dialogue. And the couple of points I wanted to mention first is, before we land into measuring, and that's what Jay will speak about, for us, the whole discussion demands and requires a cultural change. And that's why it's so important. One of our key dilemmas have been going either too fast or too slow. And both are probably wrong. We have seen in the sector many times jumping into quick solutions for really complex problems. No? We have seen in the past, for example, consultancies going around. Before it was about maybe gender equality. Then it was about safeguarding. Now the latest is diversity. And now you could see a lot of applications and advertisement for DEI consultancy. So we are seeing this again and again. We need to learn from that problem. So in a way, we cannot expect everything to be perfect. We cannot expect the culture to change in the organization because it's political in the end. It's about power and it's about letting power go or taking power from. So that doesn't happen from one day to the other. But yes, we accept we cannot wait for that to happen in order to start measuring something. So what you will hear from us today is imperfect, it's not perfect, and far from perfect, and will never be perfect. It's an attempt while we do the really and even more difficult work of changing our own culture, of challenging our own assumptions, on identifying our own racist behaviors, our colonial and post-colonial systems. And that takes time. Jay and I were talking the other day, Friday, I think, last week, and you, Jay, discovered something, and you said, oh my God, how on earth we are still measuring this? This is a traditionally global North Western idea of something. And we haven't seen it. And in theory, we are working day after day to try to identify it. So it's a fight that I think will never end. It's evolving and demands cultural change. And that's the most important and probably the most difficult thing to change. Because then once that starts happening, then the measurements, the indicators, etc., that can follow. In my mind, I could be totally wrong, and Jay may prove me wrong, but I think that's why this is so difficult. Is identifying the key indicator. Yes, but who is identifying the indicator? How they arrive to that indicator? What that means? That it means anything to our member in Thailand or to our member in Peru, and that's why this is a parallel kind of process on fight. So yes, I will stop with that. Just saying. So it is political. It is about power. It is about challenging power. People with power don't want to let it go most of the time. Sometimes yes, sometimes they stay down, etc. But this is still a culture and a system that is predominantly a white supremacy culture. And until we change that, or while we change that, the measures will come. Not an easy conversation in any organization or confederation. I found much easier to speak externally, and probably you do the same, than sometimes having the uncomfortable conversations internally. Jay, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Andres, and we'll move to the next slide. And I'm just going to talk about one specific area where we're trying to measure diversity and inclusion. We could talk about how we're trying to do this in our partnerships or in our programs, or what we're particularly, what I'm going to share our experience of, which is, again, it's not about trying to say we have the solutions. I really want to stress that this is about saying, this is our experience, here are some of our challenges, here are some of the choices we've made to address some of those challenges, and we'd really like to hear from others about how they are responding to some of these same challenges. So as Andres said, when we think about measuring diversity and inclusion in care, we're thinking of a reality of working across 100 countries, with very different contexts and with very different meanings of what diversity and inclusion might mean in those contexts. And even something which is relatively apparently easy can be complicated. So for example, we've been tracking what percentage of our staff are male or female, what percentage of our leadership and our boards are male or female for the last 7 or so years. And in the last couple of years, we also introduced the ability for countries to report what numbers of their staff and leadership and board were non-binary or had another gender identity. What is complicated there is that we only present in our kind of overall public figures for male and female staff, because the numbers of staff who are non-binary or other are actually quite small, and there's a risk of identifying individuals if you report a number for a small, say a small part of the organization. And so we have to be a bit careful there. We've also reported to the Fair Share Index, and as I show later, we've had some real struggles with their desire to report how they've incorporated the concept of diversity into that measure. and how we do that as an organization with presence across 100 countries and not just in the global north, and particularly not, say, in the US or the UK, or not just in the US and the UK, where concepts like BIPOC or BMME might be more relevant, but do not apply in many of the places we work. If we go to the next slide. We've also tried to measure our gender pay gap. And so we look at, what percentage, we get countries to group their staff into 3 groups of pay bands, upper, medium, and low, and then report the median male and female salary. And so kind of across the whole organization, we can see that we have roughly equal at senior leadership. In the middle, the male salaries are slightly higher, and in the lower pay groups, the female salaries are slightly higher, and we have overall a slightly pro-female pay gap. But this is very different in different locations, and so having these figures allows us to start having those kind of conversations where we see significant patterns of inequality that might need addressing or might need discussions around. Next, please. But when it comes to diversity, it's pretty complicated, isn't it? And so it's hard to see what's a way of measuring diversity that could work for everywhere around the world. But if we say it's too difficult or it's not legal, then we're kind of saying, well, we can't measure it. And if you can't measure it, how can you really change it or see if you're making progress? And so we have seen some approaches that are perhaps a bit kind of Anglo-American centric. So if Fair Share Index asks for data on Black, Indigenous, or women of color, how you would make that relevant for a team in India or a team in Rwanda or a team in Thailand, it's not really clear. So we can report partial data there for the context in which that is relevant, but we can't across the full 12,000 people who work for care around the world. Global Health 50/50 has been talking, they did a report this last year about board members. They particularly focused on board members from lower income countries. But that means that, say, we have a new chair of Care International who's from Kenya. So Kenya is not a lower income country. And so that's still, that doesn't count. Or we have our Secretary General is from Uruguay, which is a high income country, but from the global south. And is, someone from Uruguay, is that the same as having a CEO from the US or the UK? We kind of think not. Countries in the global south who might be high income now have traditionally had less power in the global health system before. So our approach that we've been trying for the last couple of years is to think about a concept that we use a lot in our training on equity and diversity, which is around kind of groups that have power and groups that have less power. And so we ask countries to say, well, report your staff numbers, and in terms of senior staff and male and female, that come from power down groups that would be relevant in your local context. And this is, you can see in orange there, the way that we frame that particular question. But it's around those who have less power, less access to resources, less privilege. And so next slide. What we've been able to do from this is where we did have 20 of our countries reporting data in the last year. For some reason, I can't see the figures there on the slide. I'm not sure what might have happened there. But essentially what it shows that of those 20 countries, which represent about 1/3 of care staff around the world, just under 18% of all staff are from power down groups. Just over 18% of senior staff, the middle figure, are from power down groups. And of those that have boards, we have about just over a quarter, 27% in the right-hand column, are board members who would come from power down groups in those contexts. But that was very different. So in the US, that was BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. In the UK, it was people from minoritized ethnic backgrounds. But in Nepal, it was a mixture more of religious or ethnic or a abilities. That was how they categorized power down in that context. In other contexts, it was more around religious groups in where one particular religion is particularly dominant. Whereas in other contexts, they felt that ability and having a disability was more representative of being from a power down group. And then we have some contexts where it's not clear what is allowed in the law for what you're able to report. It's not legal to collect some data on race and ethnicity. Other aspects may be possible, and so it might not be possible to have comparable data covering all countries where we have staff around the world, and that's something we're still wanting to learn from others who are facing similar challenges on. So next, please. So just off where we're at going forward, we're currently in the process of trying to work across our network on gender and inclusion to define what we mean by diversity and what that might mean for different types of office that we have. What would it mean for a care member in the global north, or a care member in the global south, or a regional office, or a kind of global structure like the Care International Secretariat where Andreas and I work. But we need to do that in ways that are truly relevant for very different local contexts, cultures, legal environments, and kind of structures themselves. We need to continue processes of embedding diversity and inclusion. We've been doing for a number of years now training on equity and diversity. That's now been reframed as reflections on equity, diversity and inclusion that we're kind of rolling out across the organization to kind of stimulate those conversations that Andreas talks about that can ultimately lead to changing culture. And we will continue this process of kind of gathering data and using that for reflection and hopefully learning from others. We do have a challenge that, where we have teams with very small numbers, as you get more granular in the type of data you're wanting to collect, there's a risk of data identifying individuals. So you kind of need to start with a minimum of 10 to 20 people in the team before you can start going too far down in this detail. And yes, so finally, which is partly what today is about, we hope, is learning from other organizations and what they're doing and what their suggestions are of what we could be doing better or different. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jay and Andreas, for the amazing presentation. I'm sure everyone is teeming with ideas and reflections after hearing your presentation, and the approach to power down grouping is very inspiring. However, if everyone can hold on to their ideas and hold on to their reflections, I will be soon breaking out into rooms so that we can discuss the questions here. The panel members will be facilitating the breakout rooms, and also and don't worry about taking down these questions. I'll send them into the chat so that folks have them with the ready. Right, welcome back, everyone. Tina, may I pass the mic on to you?
Yes, you may. Thank you, Bohan. And thank you all so much for stepping into those spaces and having those conversations. And I was privileged to be able to step in and listen to a few of those. And there was so much good stuff being shared. So I'm quite excited about this discussion that we're going to have now. I'm inspired, really. I have a few things to ask. And so I'm going to present this to our panelists, so Andre, Jay, Oriana and Jean. And so the first question that I'm going to ask really was is connected to the first question really that you discussed in your breakouts. I'm really curious to hear what was shared about people understanding what diversity and inclusion looks like for their organizations, and maybe the process that they've gone through in their organizations to be able to identify that. So really curious to hear what was shared. And so this goes to any of the panel members. You're free to jump in as the spirit moves you.
I think, I mean, we actually didn't spend as much time on that question. We actually spent a lot more time on the other two, because I think we had a group of mostly Southern Africans, actually, and Maria. But I think we all pretty much agreed on the fact that, like, diversity and inclusion is not just women and men, and that, you know, it also needs to include sort of the more marginalized groups, I suppose, as the care colleagues spoke about, which is sort of the power down groups. But I think it very much also depends on the type of organization that you're working in, because if you are, you know, one of these global organizations, then these issues have a ton of nuance within different spaces. And I think just counting men or women, or just counting white or black, or just counting sort of you know, particular religions, one or the other, or sort of sexual diversity or gender diversity, just as sort of a one or the other, is not always the most useful or the most helpful in many of the organizations in which we work. So there are so many layers to these conversations and these issues, particularly, I think, for those of us that do work in multiple contexts.
Thank you so much, Jean. Open to any other panelists. Does anyone else like to? Oriana?
Yes, I can. Yeah, I can speak a little bit about what we discussed on our group. And it was also about, like, you know, opening up safer spaces for individuals, either like staff members, or because we also, like, in our group, also people worked directly with communities. So it was just about opening those safe spaces so that people feel comfortable addressing the situation, you know, like different situations, and from their own perspective to have the power of decision making, especially in, like, you know, like grassroots organizations and whatnot, to feel that they have, you know, the perspective to create their own reality, and to have the power to actually embrace into doing this. So yeah, so it was more about giving and opening spaces for people to speak more freely about, you know, their needs, yeah, so that I mean, not we, but like people in the top do not create the, you know, the policies without taking them into consideration.
Tina, I fully agree with, won't repeat. In a way, we combine maybe 1 and 3, they're related. I think borrowing those words we were talking about, that in the end, if you want to find barriers, you will find them. And there are probably in all of our organizations, confederations, networks, there are always going to be, as I said, that human nature, people who would like to move forward, and sometimes people who maybe with the right reasons or right concerns will hold us back, yes? So the question is, how do we identify those barriers, and how do we demand, and this is not putting the burden on people of color or staff, but how do we demand from leadership to take us forward, no? And sometimes leadership has happened in the sector now. There has been some resignations, people accepting that they were not up for the job, yes? So let's talk about the uncomfortable issues here, no? Not everyone is up for the job. And if you are not, part of your self-awareness needs to help, or people can help you to realize that you are not up for it. So leadership has responsibility, therefore, that's why they have maybe bigger salaries, maybe whatever, flexibility. Therefore, leadership needs to respond and be accountable for this. But we can always find ways, even with legal frameworks that are a bit more conservative, because if the demands come from the from the staff, from the change, etc., voluntary, etc., there are ways, and each organization is different. So we didn't pretend to recommend, but just to realize how is it working for us.
Thanks,
yeah,
Mark.
and Tina, I think our group, we talked a lot about very different types of organizational model and who your clients are and who the people who are what's your membership of your constituency. And if that's all in one legal context, that's possibly less complicated than one that operates across multiple legal contexts. But even when in an organization that's a confederated model operating within just England and Wales, there are very different regional differences and demands. So I guess it's about really understanding your organization and who your constituencies are, both those internal and external.
Yeah, really great point, Jay, and great points from all of you, which lead nicely, I think, into the next couple of questions that I'm going to put to you all. So I was really struck by a couple of things from today's session. And the first being just how much time and effort it takes to engage in this work in a way that's going to generate the positive outcomes that we want to see. That's the first thing. And the second thing is really, there was a particular point that was made during the CARE International presentation about this work being political. And so for the panel, and maybe let's start with CARE, what suggestions or advice do you have for people in organizations who find themselves having to make the case for this work?
I mean, we had a really interesting conversation about, it's so complex, right? And there's a worry about not doing things perfectly or good enough. And so sometimes there's a paralysis. Like, people don't want to take the first step because they're worried about making the wrong first steps. And I guess the reflection from the group was really the only way to start is to start, and to start taking some actions and to learn from others. There was a really nice practice shared by one of the group that they've done these 90-day dynamic accountability challenges with their members, where you could do something similar, where you really kind of say, okay, we're going to put some dedicated time and effort over a short period of time to really take some action, and we'll learn and we'll get some support in that process, and we'll learn from our peers, and then we'll reflect and we'll try and improve things in the future. But I guess, yes, it's try not to get paralyzed by the complexity.
And Tina, you know this. We have had discussions across the sector, no? And we know that some of us are desperate for the change to happen. Raise my hand, and I think we are late and we're slow, etc. But anyway, we also need to accept and understand that not everyone has the same starting point. So in a huge confederation like ours, like any family, we have all the voices and all the spectrums, all well intended, but from the most progressive who have been part of the fight for many years, no, generations before, etc., to those who some of these topics are new to them or they haven't seen it, no? And we need to recognize and accept and value and welcome that, but we need to act on it. And what we have in CARE, again, not perfect, but this program on reflections on equity, diversity, inclusion, that now have been updated to include issues such as specifically anti-racism, challenge a white supremacy culture, intersectional feminism, were not in our language just a few years ago. We're not in our understanding of everyone. So we need to support, encourage, and challenge ourselves. And if you want to work with CARE, you need to be open to understand and to be challenged as well. No? We all need to be challenged and questioned. We have all been part of the system maybe for long and sometimes too long, and therefore we need to. It's a combination of self-education, I would say. Not putting on the burden of people of color sometimes to make this happen, the burden on their shoulders, because that's totally unfair. It's I would say a joint responsibility, but being careful not to victimize or re-victimize those who have been those power down positions, as you were saying.
Yes, well said, Andre. And if I might add to that, I also think that we should be kind to ourselves, because the space is so large, it's so big, there's so much to do, and basically the work is never finished, because inclusion is an ongoing, continuing journey that you have with each other. So I always advise people who work in a D&I space, please do not burn yourself out. Just start small, see if you can collect the ambassadors in your organization who have the same vision, who want to work with you towards a more inclusive organization or network. And together you can really reach that far, slowly by slowly and step by step. And it's just like Andre was saying, a lot of the terminology that we now have been adapting in the space of D&I, those are terminologies that before were more niche and were, not really so mainstream, but now they're becoming more mainstream. So change is happening, but even though, you know, I guess just like me, you all really want to make so much impact and want to do it all. But sometimes it can be just better to, you know, take small steps, make choices, maybe take different themes for a specific quarter to focus yourself on, so you can make a nice campaign around it, which can really help you as well in getting there, and you know, encouraging others to go together with you. What I really like myself is that there are so many beautiful days in a year, from you know, different perspectives. Like we have coming out day, for instance, on October 11. In the Netherlands, where I'm from, we have Diversity Day on October 4, and you can really use those days as well to start a conversation or to focus yourself on a specific topic. But even though, you know, I think we all really would love to see change happening faster and towards more equality in our organizations and in our societies, I do think it's also very good to yeah, to really take care of yourself as well.
Yeah, great point. Thank you, Ashmita. There's a lot to be said about the place of care and well-being within this work and how it needs to be centered. So thank you very much for that. I just want to go to Oriana and Jean in case you have anything else that you wanted to.
Thank you, Tina. Yes, I just wanted to add that, you know, there is this framework that is really useful to understand, you know, how the to self-evaluate the organization, which is called like Gender at Work. And it basically, it's like a structure where it's divided into 4 categories. So if I'm not mistaken, it's like, you know, something around resources, about, you know, the consciousness and capability of the organization to actually do this change. And the other 2 were like informal practices and something else. I can't remember right now. But the 2 things that I really, you know, like, informal practices are also like very important, and it's like a really easy first step, you know, to make these changes. And for example, to start adapting certain like inclusive languages, or like asking or encouraging people to name their pronouns, or how they would like to be acknowledged, or, you know, like certain adaptations in the workplaces, you know, for, you know, women that need to breast pump, or stuff like that, or gender neutral bathrooms. Sometimes like those small changes make a big difference. And then also, you know, when you start making, you know, specific surveys to be inclusive and be aware of the type of language that you use, that makes a big difference with the community, and people start responding positively to this. And then also, you know, when budgeting for the year, try to be inclusive in certain practices of like, okay, if the organization is like multinational and have like a headquarters all around the world, then include, you know, like translation services, so that people feel more comfortable expressing themselves in their own languages. And, you know, like some practices that, you know, make impact little by little, because yes, we need to start somewhere. And, you know, this is an easy way to start.
Thanks so much, Oriana. Go ahead, Jean.
Yeah, I actually just want to agree. And I posted a short list that we've been sort of adding to around how to make very small additions to things that you can do to make your space more inclusive. We have also added a list as to whether this costs money or whether this is just something that you can just do. So maybe it is about asking people about pronouns. Maybe it is about just making sure that you know, that we're creating, you know, when we have an event, that we just have a space where, you know, those with visual impairments can participate, or a quiet space for those that maybe struggle with lots of noise and light, etc., etc. So they're very small. We're also really up for people to add more. So you know, we don't own these. This is just a bit of research that we did, and things that we try to do when we can. And it's sort of, because I think this is such a complex thing. And I think that, you know, when you look at the list, some of these are communications things, some of these are about people with disabilities, some of these are about diversity issues, some of these are about you know, things about parental leave and being parents, or, you know, general HR issues, some of the programmatic issues. So yeah, I think just the sheer depth and breadth of these issues, of this issue, is really really, overwhelming sometimes.
It is. Thank you so much for that, Jean. It is. And that's one of the reasons I'm really happy to see in the chat that there are resources being shared, because I think it's of benefit to all of us who work in this space to be able to share what we learn and to share what we know and to share what we discover. And so in that vein, my next question to the panel is looking at sharing, but maybe in a different way. I'm wondering whether you would be open to sharing what maybe hasn't worked for you in your organization. So what have you tried as it relates to D&I that maybe hasn't presented the outcome that you hoped it would have? So maybe we can start with Oriana. I'm sorry, I've put you on the spot to start with you first, but
No, it's perfect. Yeah, so at CIVICUS, we are trying to create like this space for that. It actually started as a informal practice, and it was called the Diversity and Inclusion Group within the organization. So people from different clusters, we are divided in clusters, had a representative in this group, and they would just share best practices of things that they were doing. But then now it has been decided that this group needs to be like more formal, because we also wanted to be like more accountable as to actually the type of work that we were doing. But now that the group has become like more formal, the type of work has slowed down, because creating the group, actually doing the policies, redacting the scope of what the group can and cannot do, sometimes just like makes things slower. So yeah, now we are at the point where we are trying to find the balance between good practices and sharing everything, but at the same time making it like a formal structure within the organization. And we are at the point where we're not sure how to move forward. Yeah, so this is like, what shall we do now? So, and if you have any suggestions here, please do let us know.
thank you for sharing that live situation that you're in right now. Maybe Jean, if you have anything that you want to say. Nothing from you, Jean? Okay.
No, I mean, I think one of the things that we were just talking about in the previous group is how to encourage women to apply for some of our jobs. And we realized that sometimes the language that we use, which we often think is quite active, so it's things like fast-paced organization and agile and we're quick, often women check out of that because they're like, I have kids, or I can't give 16 hours of work a day. And that's not what we mean. Of course not, that's not what we mean. But people get anxious about that sort of language, and so sometimes that's something that we think it will bring people into the conversation, but it actually won't. And actually it means that women self check out, or people who are caregivers self-select out of our processes because of that. And so we're having to be quite thoughtful about how we encourage women to apply for our jobs, or encourage caregivers and or younger people, for example, who have university, or study things competing for their time. And so, yeah, I think sometimes with your best intentions, you don't always get the kind of things that you need. You don't get the responses that you think you're going to get.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jean. Maybe Andre and Jay.
Look, spaces like this are really inspiring. I know that we are now, after a couple of years of moving into this online space, we probably are a bit tired, no? Sometimes even longer hours. No, remember all those assumptions that if you are in the office, you work more. If you work from home, you are not working hard. Well, actually, we have tested, and those assumptions were wrong. No, so but we were a bit tired. But actually, events like this are inspiring. You find different ways, commonalities, and also differences, and you can learn from others. I've learned a number of things already and ideas that we would like to test. I think part of this is trying to make this day to day. It's not a programs person or team responsibility. It's not HR. It's not this. It's not that. It's everything we do. And I still remember a couple of years ago in an international civil society center space, when we were trying to bring these issues as part of lively discussion, we were told, no, this is too niche, this is very focused, this is narrow, this is not. And actually, this is all what we do. Is the how. We have focused so much, maybe too much, on the what, pretending or demonstrating, evidencing impact, the change, the what, but at what cost? How? Without dignity, over stepping on someone else's shoes, or top down or patronizing ways. All those things we didn't talk about those. No? Now, I think it's not a new battle; it's an old one, but with an opportunity to see things slightly different. Hopefully, with more allies. CARE has, for example, a white-only group of white allies. We're not part of it. I've heard great things, safe spaces people mentioned. Don't over-formalize, that's true. I was the first one when it was, I didn't feel comfortable anymore when it was so formal and etc. So not everything. And I support Doris again today in your comment of agility, no? The more we can challenge that, the better probably, no? Again, not to justify inaction, or is that a word, or no action, but we cannot, shouldn't keep oversimplifying complex issues. No?
Thank you,
And
Andre.
maybe on that one, sorry if I just grab the mic, I'm conscious of the time. I mean, for me, again, that is a typical term that we've just now adopted in the sector, and you know, it's trending, right? So you have to mention it at least in every second sentence. And sometimes it feels to me, and I'm not specifically speaking about Oxfam here, I think, but again, you know, it's us old people who are trying to dress up like we think young people might dress up, and we, you know, trying to talk like young people might talk, and then we listen to music that we think maybe young people might want to listen to, instead of just bloody getting out of the way. Sometimes that's what also, you know, I associate with us saying like, hey, let's be agile. Yeah, so I'm having an alphabet of banned words, so any suggestions, just email me.
Thank you, Doris. I like the idea of compiling something like that we can kind of all share. I see your hand up, Ashmita, so I just want to invite you in.
Yes, thank you. I was thinking, let's raise my hand to indicate that I'm willing to contribute to the panel. So because we were talking about examples which don't work well, and I want to share one example which hasn't worked so well in the Netherlands, so the country where I'm from, and it's the unconscious bias trainings. And also some research has been done around that, you know, because what we saw, especially after Black Lives Matter, is that all organizations thought we need to do something about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Let's hire an external consultant or trainer and do an unconscious bias training. And what we have learned from that is that it doesn't work. Actually, it even made matters worse because people felt that they were obliged to really take space in this discussion around unconscious bias, while they didn't even know what it meant to them as an organization, being diverse, inclusive, having an equitable environment, and also not for themselves. So that's one of the examples which hasn't worked. And I always advise organizations to not start with training, but first start with dialogues, because you know you want to know what your communities are thinking around what it doesn't mean to be diverse, what does it mean to be inclusive. How can we have like a common framework of words, because words do matter with each other around that. So I was also curious because we have such a nice, diverse and global community here in the call, what other people's experiences have been with these unconscious bias trainings.
That's a great question, Ashmita. I don't think we have time to fully open it up to the group, unfortunately. I don't know whether we will have opportunities after this to be able to engage with participants. I see someone, yeah, Bahan, I see you nodding. Okay, great. So maybe that can be one of the questions that we put to people, because I think that's a very very interesting observation and important point to make about the types of work organizations do, which I think ties into something that was shared earlier in the session about you know, organizations either going too fast or too slow with this work. Sometimes there's a frantic energy that we kind of lean into because we feel we have to be doing something, and so we just do everything, and that's not really how this is done. It's more methodical. You know, you kind of need to take your time, need to be a bit more intentional about the effort that you put into it. Okay, I want to ask the panel one final question before I hand over to Elisa to close us out. And this is a very, very quick one, so there's probably a 1 or 2 word answer. But it's really important with this work to remain inspired and to remain hopeful. So I would love it if the panel would maybe share, you know, a little something about what inspires them or what keeps them hopeful for doing this work. And as I say, it could be a 1 or 2 word answer. So maybe we can start with Jay.
I think what inspires me is to see this as a long-term struggle that we're all part of. We all have a role in. It's not just this kind of one-off exercise. You've just got to stay constantly engaged.
Excellent, thank you, Jay. Jean.
Yeah, and I think that what really inspires me is, I think, the overall commitment that people have towards this. We don't really have the answers on how to do it, I think, yet, but I think overall, there are very few organizations that I've ever come across, you know, in the last sort of couple of years where people are like, we don't believe in that at all, this is rubbish. You know, and I think that that's enough from which to start. I think now it's just about how do we do it? And it's about sharing ideas and thoughts with each other about how we do it, how we pay for it, how we create space, you know, space for it within the work, and that it's not even and that it's not an extra, that it just is who we are and it's what we do, and is embedded in our daily work.
Thank you, Jean. Andre.
Well, the personal stories, it's always amazing to hear from others what are they trying to do. For barriers and problems and what we cannot do, I have enough. I get inspired with what are you trying, what are we all trying to do, no? Individually and collectively. And even here, you can see in spaces like this, you can get ideas, and that's what gets me going. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ariana.
Yes, for me, what matters, what inspires me, it's like actually the behavioral changes. And, you know, that people say like, oh, this work actually matters. And when you hear, you know, working with specific communities, for example, we worked with a woman in the Philippines, and she was, you know, like doing a lot of like agricultural work, and she had all the knowledge, but because it was such a traditional society, even though she had the knowledge, men didn't come to ask her the information because they weren't supposed to, because, you know, like all this like roles, etc. And after, you know, having conversations with the community on the importance of diversity and inclusion and whatnot, she felt so empowered that she actually became the example to the leaders in the community, and she became the leader that started, you know, to help others on how to do the things. And those little changes make all the difference. And then you say like, oh, the work that we do matters. And yeah, you know, that sense is, I love it.
Thank you so much, Ariana. The work that we do matters. I think that's a really great place to kind of end this panel discussion. So thank you all so very much for sharing and participating. And I'll just hand over to Elisa to wrap us up.
Thank you, Tina, and thank you all for contributing with your experience and your knowledge and your honest conversations. And I just wanted to very quick, I'm very mindful of the time, so I just wanted to very quick invite you to another session that it's trying to do more or less the same thing, but going a bit deeper in what it is to shift the power. Inclusion, diversity and inclusion is kind of the first step. Then what happens? Justice, equity, and so forth, so on. How power is elusive, no? So how we question ourselves, the status quo, and move forward to build other things. Diversity and inclusion has a key role in it. But then as we move along, and I think Andres was saying, like, we see barriers, but we see also demands. How do we make this from one side go away and the demands be heard? How do we, from our place of power, each of us have power, how do we use it to start, as Oriana was also saying, like the social norms, the informal practices? From these informal practices, how can we start changing things? And Ashmita said something that really struck me, saying like, you're very eager to change things. This is a process. You don't see things changing. Why is it that? But if you start doing things and reflecting and also doing by yourself, no matter what's happening in the outside, of course, you want to influence structures and behavior and culture, but how do you do this? So we're going to have a task force conversation. And what we're trying to do is we all, as we could see in the chat, we all have resources. We all have cool initiatives that we're implementing, lessons learned as well. So we want to identify these key components that cover all of these things to shift the power and what we can do as individuals to start shifting the power. So the task force will be composed for 2 sessions. I put in the chat, and maybe I'll just do it again so you can sign in and see our draft concept now. Conversations are happening in different levels, as Andres also was saying, or Jay. But the reflection on how can you do something to advance the shifting the power can come from also personally. So we want to have this discussion while the world still manage and agreeing on what is the right process and stuff. So yeah, we just want to invite you there and please sign on and come and join us, because we want to produce something. It will be 2 sessions only. The first one would be to identify the key components and then kind of wrap them up as, for example, I think Jay was saying, like, do not be afraid. The 10 steps of how to shift the power, beginning with our own experience. How to, don't be afraid, just start, and then just share one of the examples that one of our organizations or our member organizations, how they started. And so on and so forth. And so the second session would be about translating those key components into a cheat sheet or something that inspire others, at least to bring the conversations in their organizations. And that is not a one webinar, as Ashmita was saying, that and tick the box and say like, oh, okay, we already talked about this. No, like to really encourage people to start a process that is embedded in the way they work, in the day-to-day work. So yeah, so if you're interested, I think then Bauhan also will share it in an email for the ones that leave a bit early, but we will be really, really happy to have you there to continue the conversation and identify key steps for everybody that wants to start working on shifting the power or continue working in shifting the power to do so. And thank you so much for everything. Thank you, Tina. As always, a pleasure.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Andreas. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Jean.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. Bye.
Bye.